The water in my skiff was the wrong color. Had been since I pulled away from the Chapatula Street dock 3 hours ago. Not the muddy brown you'd expect from floodwater. More like, I don't know, green tea left sitting too long? No, darker. Like when Sarah used to make that kale smoothie crap and leave it in the fridge for a week. Point is, it wasn't right. My Evinrude 20-year-old 40-horse that I bought off Dupree's cousin after the engine fire incident, the one the Coast Guard loved bringing up during my discharge hearing, sputtered through what used to be Rampart Street. Mardi Gras floats bobbed against second-story balconies, their papier-mâché faces grinning at nothing. A gator, maybe 8 feet, slid off a king cake float as I passed. Its eyes caught the afternoon light wrong. Too bright, like those cheap glow sticks kids crack open at parades. "Caleb, you copy?" The radio crackled. Martinez, probably. Still on my case about the Henderson rescue, like I was supposed to know the woman had already been dead 2 hours before I dove. "Rourke, command wants you back at staging. Federal crews are prepping the levee breach at." I switched it off. 16 years in the Guard, and they still thought I gave a damn about command wanting me back. They'd made it real clear during the hearing that my wanting anything didn't matter much anymore. My godson Trey was somewhere in the 9th Ward. His mama Charisse, my ex-partner Devon's widow, had called me yesterday morning, voice shaking so bad I could barely understand her. He went to check on Miss Eudora's house, Caleb, before the second surge hit. I told him not to, I told him, but he said she'd been alone too long, and her dialysis machine. The line went dead after that. Cell towers were down across half the parish. Trey was 19, same age I was when I joined up, full of that stupid conviction that competence equals obligation. That if you can do something, you should. My therapist, the one the Guard made me see after the Henderson thing, said I had an unhealthy relationship with responsibility. $200 an hour to tell me I care too much. Real helpful, Doc. The skiff's hull scraped something under the surface. I killed the engine, let momentum carry me forward. Through the murky water, I could see the remains of a Popeye sign. The letters still visible, Louisiana Kitchen. The waterline had risen another 2 feet since this morning. The levees were already compromised in 3 places. I'd heard the crews talking about controlled breaches, flooding the lower wards to save the rest of the city. Standard disaster protocol. Made perfect sense on paper. Trey's neighborhood was in the lowest part of the lower wards. I restarted the engine, took 4 pulls, reminded me I needed to replace the spark plugs, had been meaning to do it since June, and continued east. Past submerged cars with their alarms still somehow blaring underwater, that muffled electronic scream. Past a corner store where someone had spray-painted "We Here" on the roof, though I couldn't see anyone. Past 3 different houses with dogs barking from second-floor windows. The weird thing wasn't the flooding. Category 5 does what it does, and New Orleans has always been more water than land, whatever the tourist board tells you. The weird thing was the smell. Chemical sweet, like industrial cleaning product mixed with rotting vegetation. And the wildlife acting strange. Not fleeing the water, but attracted to it. That gator with the glowing eyes wasn't the first I'd seen. Nutria rats the size of house cats were swimming in circles around partially submerged trees, not going anywhere, just circling. This is Emergency Broadcast System Relay 794, a different channel, one I hadn't switched off. Federal Health Service issues mandatory water contact warning for Orleans Parish and surrounding areas. Do not touch floodwater. Do not consume floodwater. Avoid all exposure to. Static ate the rest. My hands were already soaked. Had been since I launched. You can't operate a skiff in 10 feet of standing water without getting wet. That's just physics. The Coast Guard knew that. I knew that. But mandatory water contact warnings weren't standard protocol, not even for sewage contamination, which this had to be. Broken treatment plants, chemical runoff, the usual post-hurricane soup. Except the usual post-hurricane soup didn't make alligators' eyes glow. I passed a street sign barely visible above the waterline. Claiborne Avenue. 2 more blocks to Miss Eudora's house. Trey would have tied up to her porch railing, same as I was planning to do. The kid was good on the water. Devon had taught him before the cancer took him, back when Trey was still small enough to need a life vest. Devon would have been proud. Devon would have also kicked his ass for coming out here during a mandatory evacuation. A jazz horn echoed from somewhere north. Tinny, wrong, like a recording played through bad speakers. Some automated tourist trap still running on backup power, playing for an audience of fish and floodwater. The sound bounced off abandoned buildings, doubled back on itself. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The water got darker as I entered the 9th Ward proper. The green tea color deepened to something like old pennies, with an oily sheen that caught the light in rainbow patterns. More gators, more rats, all moving in those same slow circles like they'd forgotten where they were going. Miss Eudora's house was a single-story shotgun painted yellow, or it had been before 8 feet of water reduced it to just a roof and part of the front door. No skiff tied to the porch, no signs of Trey, but the door was open, hanging crooked on its hinges, and I could see darkness inside where the water had risen past the windows. I tied off to what was left of the porch railing, double bowline muscle memory from 16 years of doing it right, and cut the engine. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. Water lapping against walls. That distant, distorted jazz. Something splashing, too rhythmic to be random. Trey? My voice sounded wrong in the flooded street. Too loud and too quiet at once. Trey, you in there? Movement inside the house. Not surface water movement, but something underneath pushing through the darkness. I grabbed my dive light from the emergency kit, the same Pelican 7060 LED I'd carried since my first deep water certification, the one with the crack in the housing from the rig fire in '09, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the murky water inside Miss Eudora's house. For a second, I saw nothing unusual, just floating debris, a toppled bookshelf, what might have been a wheelchair, and then something moved past the doorway. Fast. Too fast for the current. My hand went to my dive knife without thinking. Stupid instinct, like a knife would do anything against. Against what? I still didn't know what I was looking at. The shape had been wrong. Too elongated. Moving with a purpose that didn't match the lazy drift of everything else in the water. Coast Guard, I called out even though I wasn't not anymore. Anyone in there need assistance? The splashing sound stopped. Then started again, closer. A hand broke the surface inside the doorway. Human hand, pale fingers, reaching for the doorframe. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped the light. Jesus, okay, I'm coming in. Just hold on. The hand pulled, and the rest of the arm emerged. Then the head. Then I saw what used to be Miss Eudora, and relief turned to something else entirely. Her eyes glowed like the gators. Her mouth hung open, and there was something growing in her throat. Not blocking it, growing from it. Thin white tendrils that moved independent of her breathing, waving in the air like sea anemone tentacles. She looked at me, or through me, and made a sound that might have been words but came out as gurgling clicks. I pushed away from the porch railing hard enough to make the skiff rock. My hand found the ignition, pulled the starter cord. The engine coughed once and died. Behind me, Miss Eudora's body, because that's what it was now, just a body being used for something else, slid further out the doorway into the water. The tendrils in her throat had grown longer. They reached toward me like fingers. No, 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 come on. Second pull. Third. The Evinrude caught on the 4th try, and I gunned it backward, away from that house, away from what used to be a woman Trey's mama had known since childhood, away from those white-reaching things that I knew, somehow weren't supposed to exist in any biology I understood. The skiff's wake churned the oily water. Something brushed against my ankle under the boat. Probably debris had to be debris. but I jerked my foot up anyway. The skin where the floodwater had touched was starting to itch. Just irritation, I told myself. Chemical burn from sewage contamination. That's all. Miss Eudora's body slipped completely underwater, but I could still see her eyes glowing beneath the surface, getting dimmer as she sank, until the murky water swallowed her completely. My radio, the one I'd switched off, crackled back to life on its own. Immediate evacuation of all remaining personnel. Federal breach operation commencing at 1900 hours. All vessels return to staging area. This is not a drill. Levy demolition in. I looked at my watch. The hands were stuck at 3:47, probably from water damage. My phone was dead. I had no idea what time it was, except that the sun was starting to sink west, and 1900 hours was sunset, and if I didn't find Trey before they breached those levees, the controlled flood would sweep the lower wards clean. That was the whole point. Wash everything out into Lake Pontchartrain, start fresh. Everything included Trey if he was still alive. I pointed the skiff east and opened the throttle. The federal staging area was set up on the Interstate 10 overpass, one of the few places still fully above water. I could see it from 2 blocks away. Humvees, decontamination tents, guys in hazmat suits that looked like they belonged to CDC or FEMA or one of those agencies that shows up when shit gets biological. The kind of response you don't see for regular flooding. I needed information, and the guard wasn't going to give it to me willingly. Not after the Henderson incident, not after the disciplinary hearing, definitely not after I'd ignored Martinez's direct order to return to staging. But I knew someone who might still talk to me. Dr. Sarah Hales had been the medical examiner attached to our Coast Guard unit for 3 years before I got discharged. Smart, competent, and most importantly, she owed me for not reporting that time she showed up to a rescue op still half drunk from her sister's wedding. We'd pulled 17 people off rooftops that day, and she'd been professional enough when it counted, so I'd kept my mouth shut. I tied up at a partially submerged gas station, a Shell, the one on St. Bernard Avenue where I used to buy scratch-offs when I was feeling optimistic about my life choices, and waded through waist-deep water to reach the overpass access ramp. The itch on my ankle had spread to my calf. I ignored it, had bigger problems than skin irritation. Rourke. Martinez spotted me before I made it to the checkpoint. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Eyes red, uniform soaked, radio clutched so tight his knuckles were white. "Where the hell have you been?" Commands had APB out for 2 hours. "Looking for my godson, 16-year-old kid in the 9th ward. You seen anyone matching?" "Nobody's seen anyone." He grabbed my arm. "We need to get you decontaminated. Now, how long were you in direct water contact?" "Since this morning." "Why? It's just sewage contamination, right? Chemical runoff from..." Jesus Christ. He pulled me toward the nearest decontamination tent. "You haven't been listening to the broadcasts. It's not sewage. They're calling it a parasite, but that's not exactly right. Something in the water. Something that got stirred up when the hurricane hit or mutated or, look, I don't understand the science, but I've seen what it does to people." The itch was burning now. I looked down at my leg. The skin was red where the floodwater had touched it, but not like a rash. More like something was moving underneath. Small bumps, shifting position, crawling. "How fast does it spread?" Martinez's expression told me everything I needed to know. Hours, maybe. Depends on exposure duration, water contact area, probably a dozen other factors we don't understand yet. The medical staff can give you something to slow it down, but they can't stop it. I pulled my arm free. "I need to talk to Hales." "Where is she?" "In the medical tent processing." "Rourke, you can't just walk in there without decontamination." I was already moving. The federal checkpoint guards tried to stop me, but I had 16 years of experience bullshitting my way past military personnel, and they were focused on the bigger crisis of contaminated civilians flooding in from the lower wards. I ducked under the checkpoint barrier and headed for the medical tent. Inside was chaos. 30, maybe 40 people on cots, all showing various stages of infection. Most were unconscious. A few were restrained. One man in the corner was making that same gurgling click sound I'd heard from Miss Eudora, and the white tendrils were emerging from his mouth, reaching toward the nearest person. A nurse who was backing away slowly, like sudden movement would trigger something. Dr. Hales was at the far end, bent over a microscope. She didn't look up when I approached. "Rourke," Martinez radioed ahead. "Sit down. Roll up your pant leg. Let me see the exposure site. I need to know what this is first. You need treatment first. Trey's still out there." That made her look up. "Davon skeet?" "Shit." She stood, grabbed a metal stool, shoved it at me. "Sit. Talk while I work." I sat, rolled up my pant leg. The bumps under my skin had multiplied. Looked like maybe a dozen now, each about the size of a grain of rice, moving in slow circles under the epidermis. Hales took one look and her jaw tightened. "Okay, the official story is waterborne parasite, strain unknown, probably stirred up from contaminated sediment during the storm. The unofficial story, the one they're not broadcasting because it'll cause mass panic, is that this thing isn't natural. Wrong protein structure, wrong reproduction method, wrong everything. Best guess is industrial contamination meeting hurricane conditions, creating some kind of toxic biological hybrid that shouldn't exist." She swabbed my leg with something that burned. "Preliminary tests show it enters through any break in the skin, even microscopic ones. Once it's in your bloodstream, it heads straight for major organs and nervous system. Time from exposure to completion varies. 6 hours minimum, 24 max. You've been in the water since this morning?" "Yeah." "Then you've got maybe 12 hours left. Probably less." She wasn't looking at me anymore. "The treatment is experimental. Combination antiparasitic and chemotherapy agent. It'll make you sick as hell, and there's a 40% mortality rate from the treatment alone. But without it, you've got 0% survival." The man in the corner stopped making clicking sounds, the tendrils retreating back into his throat. Then his eyes opened, glowing that same wrong light green, and he started screaming. "That's stage 3, Hales said quietly. Neural integration. The parasite fully colonizes the nervous system. Victim loses motor control, higher brain function deteriorates. Eventually it's just reflexes and the parasite driving the body. Looking for water, looking for other hosts." She prepared a syringe, tapped out the air bubbles. "We've got maybe 40 confirmed stage 3 cases in the city right now. Federal response is demolishing the levees, flooding the lower wards completely, washing everything into the lake. Kill it with drowning, essentially. That'll kill everyone in the flood zone. Everyone who's infected is already dead. They just don't know it yet." She injected the experimental treatment into my arm. It burned going in, like fire in my veins. "The people who aren't infected need to evacuate. That includes your godson, assuming he's still clean. But Rourke, if he's been in the water more than an hour." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I stood up. The tent spun a little and Hales caught my arm. "The treatment works better if you rest. Pushing yourself will accelerate the progression." "How long until the levee breach?" She checked her watch. 90 minutes. Maybe less if the engineers decide the structural integrity is. I was already heading for the tent exit. Martinez tried to block me, but I pushed past him. Made it back to the skiff before the nausea hit. Leaned over the side and vomited into the floodwater, the same floodwater that had infected me, that was probably infecting everyone who touched it, that was turning the entire lower 9th ward into some kind of biological nightmare that shouldn't exist. My hands were shaking, the experimental treatment or fear or both. I wiped my mouth, started the engine, and headed back toward Miss Eudora's house. Because Trey wouldn't have stopped there. If he'd found Miss Eudora already transformed, he would have run. And if he ran, he'd head for the one place in the 9th Ward we'd always told him was safe. The old Coast Guard station on Poland Avenue, the one they decommissioned after Katrina. Trey's dad Devon used to take him there as a kid, back when it was still operational. It was on slightly higher ground, might have stayed above the worst flooding. Might have. The sun was sinking fast now. The water had turned from murky green to black, and navigation was getting difficult. I'd memorized these streets 16 years ago during my first post-Katrina deployment, but floodwater makes everything alien. Street signs were useless. Buildings were landmarks except when they were underwater. I was navigating by memory and prayer, and both were unreliable. Something bumped the hull, too big to be debris. I killed the engine, grabbed my light, scanned the water. Nothing visible, but the surface rippled in patterns that didn't match wind or current. Circles, just like the gators, the rats, everything infected moving in those same purposeless circles. A head broke the surface 10 feet from the skiff. Human head, male, middle-aged. His eyes glowed. The tendrils were emerging from his mouth, his nose, his ears. He looked at me with what might have been recognition, might have been hunger, might have been nothing at all. Then he sank back under, and the ripples continued, circling. I restarted the engine and kept moving. The old Coast Guard station emerged from the darkness like a ghost. 2 stories, brick construction, designed to withstand Category 3 storms. The first floor was completely submerged, but the second floor windows were above the waterline, and I could see light inside. Flashlight? Candle? Didn't matter, someone was alive in there. I cut the engine 50 feet out, let momentum carry me to the building side. No easy way to tie up, the usual mooring points were underwater, so I looped my rope around a second-floor window bar and pulled the skiff tight against the brick wall. The itch in my leg had spread to my hip now. Maybe my imagination, but I thought I could feel things moving in my bloodstream. Rice grain parasites swimming toward my heart. "Trey," I called up at the lit window. "Trey, it's Caleb." Movement inside. Then a face appeared at the window. Young, black, terrified. "Trey, thank Christ." "Uncle Caleb?" His voice cracked. He was 19 but sounded 12. "Uncle Caleb, I can't. The water's wrong. There's something wrong with—" "I know. I'm coming up. Is there a rope up there? Anything I can climb?" The fire escapes underwater. Internal stairs are flooded. I've been stuck since, I don't know, hours. My phone died, and the radio's not working, and I can hear them down there, in the water, making those sounds. "Listen to me." I kept my voice calm. The way Devon had taught me during our first joint rescue op, stay calm, because panic spreads faster than fire. There's a federal operation happening in 90 minutes. They're breaching the levees, flooding everything. We need to get you out before then. Do you have any rope? Electrical cord? Anything? He disappeared from the window. I heard him moving around inside, the sound of furniture scraping. Below me, the water rippled. More circling shapes. How many people had already been infected? How many were down there right now, swimming in those purposeless circles, their nervous systems colonized by something that shouldn't exist? Trey reappeared with an orange extension cord, the heavy-duty kind contractors use. "Will this work?" "Tie it to something solid. Window frame, radiator, anything that won't move. Make it a double knot. You remember how I showed you?" "Yeah, like you taught me when Dad..." He trailed off. Devon had died when Trey was 15. Kid had basically grown up at Coast Guard stations, learning knots and rescue protocols the way other kids learn baseball. Should have been enough. Should have prepared him for this. Nothing prepared you for this. The extension cord came down the wall. I tugged it twice, solid anchor. Started climbing. My legs screamed protest, the infected skin burning where it scraped against brick. The treatment Hales had given me was making my vision swim, or maybe that was the parasite. Hard to tell where the treatment ended and the infection began. Halfway up, my hand slipped. I caught myself on a windowsill, but the jolt sent pain shooting through my infected leg. I looked down reflexively and immediately regretted it. 3 glowing pairs of eyes stared up from the water directly below. Stage 3 victims, their bodies moving with that wrong swimming motion, circling the building. Circling me. "Uncle Caleb, are you okay?" "Fine. Just give me a second." I forced myself to keep climbing. My arms were shaking. The nausea was back, worse than before. One of the shapes below broke from its circular pattern and swam directly toward the wall, toward me, toward the skiff. I pulled myself over the windowsill as the infected woman reached my boat. She grabbed the hull with both hands, those white tendrils emerging from her mouth, reaching, touching the fiberglass, and pulled herself halfway in. The skiff rocked violently. My emergency kit spilled into the water. Flares, first aid, the spare fuel can. No! I reached back out the window, stupid instinct to save supplies I was going to need for the return trip, and the woman's tendrils whipped toward my extended hand. I jerked back just in time. The tendrils hit the windowsill instead, and where they touched, the wood started smoking. Not burning, smoking, like acid or concentrated alkali, biological corrosion that left black marks on the painted surface. Trey pulled me fully inside. Jesus Christ, what is that thing? Infected, parasite in the floodwater. Don't touch them. Don't let them touch you. I watched my skiff rock as the woman pulled herself further in, then finally capsized it. The Evinrude went under with a burping sound. There went our transportation. How do we get out of here? Good question. The building was surrounded by contaminated water. The levee breach was happening in, I checked my non-functional watch, gave up less than an hour probably. We were on an island in a sea of infection, and the federal government was about to turn that sea into an ocean. I looked around the room. Standard guard station setup, radio equipment, dead, emergency supplies looted or water damaged, maps, useless now, and one thing that might actually help, a survival raft still in its canister. The kind we used to carry for ocean rescues, self-inflating, bright orange, rated for 8 people. We're taking that. I pointed. Trey helped me carry it to the window. It weighed maybe 40 pounds, manageable between 2 people. Below us, more glowing eyes appeared in the water. 5 victims now, all circling, all waiting. Uncle Caleb, your leg. I looked down. The bumps under my skin had grown. Some were pushing up against the epidermis, creating visible lumps. In maybe an hour, they'd break through. In maybe 6 hours, I'd be down there circling with the others, my nervous system colonized, my body just a vehicle for spreading contamination. The treatment's slowing it down, I lied. Bullshit. Trey had his mother's ability to cut through lies with a single word. You're infected. How long do you have? Long enough to get you out. I pulled the raft's inflation cord. It hissed to life, expanding in seconds into a bright orange 6-person diamond shape. When I say jump, you jump. Aim for the center. Don't touch the water. We'll paddle toward the interstate overpass. There's a federal staging area with decontamination protocols. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Another lie, but he was 19 and scared and wanted to believe it, so he nodded. I counted the infected in the water. 7 now. More arriving every minute, drawn by light or sound or some chemical signature I didn't understand. The raft floated in the floodwater like a beacon. I grabbed the only weapon available, a fire extinguisher from the wall mount, and dropped it into the raft. On 3. 1, 2. An air horn blasted from the north. Not the distorted jazz I'd heard earlier, this was modern electronic, the kind they use for emergency warnings. The levee breach alarm. They were starting early. 3. Trey jumped, landed center raft, perfectly balanced. The kid had his father's water instincts. I followed, and my infected leg almost buckled on landing. Pain shot up my hip, my spine, my skull. The bumps under my skin were moving faster now, responding to the movement, to the stress. Or maybe they knew the levees were about to breach, and they wanted to spread before the flood came. I grabbed the emergency paddles from the raft's supply kit. Trey took one, and we started paddling west, toward the interstate. Behind us, the infected followed. Their swimming was purposeful now, no longer circling, chasing. "Paddle faster," I said. The air horn kept blasting. In the distance, I heard the first explosion, controlled demolition of the weakest levee point. Then a sound like thunder, but sustained, building. The sound of Lake Pontchartrain being invited back to reclaim the city it had always wanted. The water level started rising. The wall of water came from the north, a 6-foot surge that turned streets into rivers and rivers into inland seas. Our raft lifted, spun, slammed against a partially submerged building. Trey lost his paddle. I grabbed his arm before he could go over the side. Behind us, the infected rode the surge like body surfers, their glowing eyes tracking us through the chaos. They were faster in moving water. The parasite knew water, knew how to use current and flow to its advantage. We were paddling against the flood. They were riding it. "Uncle Caleb, we're not gonna make it." He was right. The staging area was half a mile away, and the surge was pushing us east, back toward the lower wards, toward complete inundation. In minutes, the entire 9th ward would be underwater. In minutes, we'd be swimming. In minutes, Trey would be exposed. I looked at my leg. The bumps had broken through in 3 places. White tendrils, thin as hair, emerging from the skin. Not moving yet. Still dormant, still waiting, but growing. I had maybe an hour before stage 3. Maybe less. Change of plans. I pointed east, toward the industrial district. The old water treatment plant. It's on concrete pylons 20 feet above the original floodplain. If we can reach it before the surge. That's the opposite direction from help. Help's compromised. The staging area's going to be underwater in 5 minutes. The treatment plant's our best shot. I didn't mention that the treatment plant had been shut down for environmental violations in 2018, or that it was probably where this whole biological nightmare started. Some combination of industrial chemicals and hurricane disruption and contaminated sediment creating a perfect storm for mutation. Hales had said it wasn't natural. She was right. This was industrial accident meets natural disaster meets human hubris. And I'd been swimming in it for 12 hours. We paddled east. The infected followed, but the surge was working against them now. They were designed for circling, for hunting in calm water, not for navigating rapids. 2 got pulled under by the current. 3 more slammed into a capsized car and didn't resurface. That left 4, and they were falling behind. The treatment plant emerged from the flood like an industrial cathedral. All pipes and holding tanks and concrete platforms. Just like I remembered from my hazmat certification course in 2015, when they'd used it as a training site for chemical spill scenarios. The main platform was indeed above the waterline, maybe 15 feet, accessible only by metal ladder built into the pylon. I pointed. There. We climb up. We're safe until the water recedes. And then what? And then I complete my transformation into stage 3 while you watch, probably. And then federal containment teams find us and execute standard biohazard protocol, which means flame units and mass graves. And then your mama buries her husband's best friend and her only son in the same week. And then we signal for rescue, I said. Trey didn't believe me, but he grabbed the ladder first, started climbing. I followed, and every rung sent agony through my infected leg. The tendrils were fully emerged now, 6 inches long, waving in the air like they were tasting it, like they were searching for something. We reached the platform as the surge hit the treatment plant's base. The entire structure shuddered. Below us, contaminated water swirled around the pylons, rising fast. The infected were still following, still swimming, still hunting. One grabbed the ladder and started climbing. I kicked at her hands. My boot connected, and she fell back into the water with a splash. But two more were already at the ladder base. Stage 3 didn't feel pain, didn't get tired, didn't stop until the host body physically failed. "Trey, get behind me." He moved back. I grabbed the fire extinguisher I'd saved from the Coast Guard station, aimed it at the ladder, and sprayed. White foam covered the metal, made it slippery. The infected trying to climb slid back down, their hands unable to grip. It bought us maybe a minute. The water kept rising and rising. The surge wasn't stopping. The levee breach had been more catastrophic than the engineers planned, or the lake had more volume than they'd calculated, or both. Either way, the water level was approaching the platform. In 5 minutes, we'd be swimming again. In 5 minutes, Trey would be exposed. I looked around the platform desperately. The treatment facility's main building was locked, but the control room door hung open, its electronic lock fried by floodwater. Inside would be higher ground, maybe another level up, maybe enough time to movement in my peripheral vision. I turned just as an infected man pulled himself onto the platform from the other side. No ladder there. He must have climbed up the outside of the pylon, found handholds in the concrete. The tendrils from his mouth were thick as fingers now, reaching, searching. I raised the fire extinguisher and sprayed him full in the face. He didn't react. Stage 3 didn't care about irritation, about breathing difficulty, about anything except spreading. He kept coming. I swung the extinguisher like a bat, caught him in the temple. He staggered, fell to one knee, and I hit him again. This time he went down. The tendrils kept moving, kept reaching, even as his body lay motionless. "Oh God," Trey said behind me. "Uncle Caleb, your leg." I looked down. The tendrils had spread from my calf to my thigh, my hip, creeping up my abdomen. Dozens of them now, thin white worms emerging from my skin, waving in the air, searching. My vision swam. The treatment Hales had given me was losing the battle. How long until stage 3? Hour? Minutes? "Listen to me." I grabbed Trey's shoulders, made him look at me instead of the infection. "Inside that control room, there should be a ladder to the roof. Get up there. When the water recedes, signal for help. Flags, smoke, whatever you can find. Federal teams will come eventually." "What about you?" "I'm buying you time." I shoved him toward the control room door. "Go. Now, don't look back." He went. Smart kid. Knew when arguing was useless. I turned back to the platform edge. The water had reached within 3 feet of the concrete. More infected were climbing the pylons now. I counted 5, maybe 6, all moving with that wrong coordination. The fire extinguisher was nearly empty. I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the platform. The tendrils on my leg were reaching toward the water, toward the infected, like they recognized each other, like they wanted to join. I looked at my hands, still human, still mine. The infection hadn't reached my upper body yet, hadn't colonized my nervous system. I still had control, still had maybe 20 minutes before stage 3. Still had one last thing I could do. The treatment plant's main holding tank was directly below the platform, a massive concrete basin that had once held millions of gallons of contaminated water for processing. Now it was just a deep pit, partially flooded by the surge. If I could get the infected into that tank, trap them there, buy Trey enough time to get to the roof and signal for rescue. I grabbed the platform's safety railing and pulled. It was loose, corrosion from years of chemical exposure. Second pull, it came free. 10 feet of aluminum pipe, solid enough to use as a weapon or a pole. The first infected pulled herself onto the platform. I used the pipe to push her back over the edge. She fell into the holding tank below with a splash. Number 2 came up behind her. I swept his legs and he followed. 3 and 4 climbed up together. I barely managed to knock them both back. But 5 and 6 were already up, and 7, and the water level was still rising. My vision blurred. The tendrils had reached my chest now, emerging from my sternum, my ribs. I could feel them inside me, threading through my cardiovascular system, wrapping around my heart. Not squeezing yet, just holding, waiting. The infected surrounded me, their glowing eyes all fixed on my face, the tendrils from their mouths reaching toward me, toward the infection in my body, toward something I couldn't understand and didn't want to. I backed toward the control room door. Trey should be on the roof by now, should be safe. That was what mattered. That was all that. My infected leg buckled. I went down hard, the aluminum pipe clattering away across the platform. The infected moved closer. Their tendrils touched my skin, and where they made contact, my own tendrils responded, reaching up to meet them, intertwining. And suddenly I understood. They weren't attacking. They were connecting. The parasite wasn't spreading through violence, it was spreading through contact, through integration. Every host became part of a network, a biological system sharing information, sharing resources, sharing. A sound escaped my throat. Not words. Clicks and gurgles, the same sounds I'd heard from Miss Eudora. From the man in the medical tent. Stage 3 wasn't death. It was transformation. It was becoming part of something larger. No, I'd spent 16 years in the Coast Guard saving people. I'd screwed up with Henderson. Dove too late, stayed down too long, brought up a corpse instead of a survivor, but I'd saved hundreds before that. Hundreds. I wasn't going to spend my last minutes becoming part of some biological nightmare that killed people like Trey's dad, like Miss Eudora, like everyone in the 9th Ward who couldn't evacuate in time. I forced myself to my feet. The infected surrounded me, but they weren't attacking, just reaching, just trying to connect. I stumbled toward the edge of the platform, toward the holding tank. The water in it was 10 feet deep now, rising fast. Deep enough. I looked back at the control room door one last time. Trey, stay on that roof. Don't come down. Don't come looking for me. Then I jumped. The water hit me like ice despite the warm September night. The infection in my body responded immediately, the tendrils extending, reaching, searching for other hosts. But there were no other hosts. Just me and the infected I'd knocked into the holding tank. All of us swimming in contaminated water, all of us connected. I dove deep, found the tank's drainage valve, a manual control rusted shut, but my hands still worked. My human hands. I gripped the wheel and turned. Fought me. 16 years of neglect had fused the mechanism. Above me, more infected dropped into the tank. Following, connecting, the network was pulling them in, pulling me in, pulling everyone toward integration. The valve will moved. 1 inch. 2. The tendrils were in my throat now, emerging from my mouth, but I could still breathe, still think, still turn the wheel. 3 inches. 4. The valve opened. Water rushed out through the drainage pipe, thousands of gallons per second, heading toward the underground treatment system, toward the outflow pipes that led to the Gulf, taking the infected with it, taking me with it. The current pulled me down, through the valve, into darkness. My lungs burned. The tendrils in my throat closed off my airway, but I was a trained diver. I knew how to hold my breath, how to stay calm under pressure, how to survive underwater longer than any parasite expected. The drainage pipe was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, and pitch black. I felt the sides scraping my shoulders, my head. Felt the current pushing me through miles of underground infrastructure. Felt the other infected bodies bumping against me in the darkness. All of us heading toward the outflow, toward the Gulf, toward salt water that might kill the parasite or might just spread it further. My vision went dark, not from lack of light, from lack of oxygen, from stage 3 finally completing, from the parasite taking over my nervous system. The last thing I thought before I stopped thinking in human words was that Trey was safe, on the roof, above the water, away from the infection. That had to be enough. That was all I had left to give. The federal containment teams found Trey 3 days later, still on the treatment plant roof, dehydrated, sunburned, traumatized, but alive, uninfected. They found my body 2 weeks after that, washed up in a tidal marsh near Port Fourchon. The parasite was dead, salt water had killed it, apparently. Some combination of salinity and temperature and exposure that broke down its cellular structure. Dr. Hales wrote a paper about it later. Novel halophobic properties of hurricane-generated biological contaminant. Got published in some medical journal I'd never heard of. They didn't find Miss Eudora. Didn't find most of the infected. The levee breach had washed them into Lake Pontchartrain and from there into the Gulf and from there, who knows? The official death toll from the parasite outbreak was 247. The unofficial estimate was closer to 2,000. Charisse came to my funeral. Trey didn't. I understood. Kid had watched his godfather, his dead father's best friend, the man who was supposed to protect him, transform into something that wasn't human anymore. That kind of trauma doesn't heal with a cemetery service and a folded flag. Martinez gave the eulogy, mentioned the Henderson incident because of course he did, but also mentioned the 17 people I'd saved the day Hales showed up drunk, the families I'd evacuated during the '08 floods, the kid I'd pulled from a capsized boat in 12. Tried to balance the scales, make the math work out. Dr. Hales told Charisse about the experimental treatment, about how it had bought me enough time to get Trey to safety, about how my sacrifice had given federal teams crucial data for developing antiparasitic protocols, about how the drainage valve I'd opened had redirected contaminated water away from civilian evacuation routes, potentially saving hundreds more lives. Charisse nodded and said thank you and went home to her son, who wouldn't talk about what happened on that roof, wouldn't talk about his godfather, wouldn't go near water deeper than a bathtub. 3 months later, the 9th ward was still mostly empty. Federal buyouts had relocated most residents to higher ground. The treatment plant was demolished, controlled explosion, reduced it to rubble in under a minute. The Coast Guard station where Devon had taught Trey how to tie knots was condemned. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the tide was low, fishermen near Port Fourchon reported strange lights in the water, glowing green, moving in circles. The Fish and Wildlife Service investigated twice and found nothing, probably just bioluminescent algae, they said, common after hurricane disturbances. Probably. Trey turned 20 in November. Charisse called Martinez to let him know. Trey had started therapy, started talking again, even mentioned maybe going back to school, maybe studying marine biology, maybe understanding what had happened, what had infected the water, what had killed his godfather. Maybe finding a way to make sure it never happened again. Martinez filed that information with the rest of the post-disaster documentation. Then he went back to his regular duties, his regular rescues, his regular disasters. Because the thing about living on the Gulf Coast is that there's always another hurricane coming, always another flood, always another emergency that turns ordinary people into heroes or corpses. Usually both. The water in the bayou returned to its normal brown color by December. The gators stopped glowing. The rats went back to being normal-sized. Life continued because that's what life does. It adapts, it survives, it moves forward through the wreckage. And every year on the anniversary, Charisse and Trey drive to Port Fourchon and put flowers in the marsh where they found my body. They don't stay long. They don't talk much. But they remember. They remember Caleb Rourke, discharged Coast Guard diver, screw-up alcoholic, the guy who dove too late for Mrs. Henderson. The guy who dove at exactly the right time for Trey. The guy who turned the valve. That's all any of us can do in the end. Turn the valve, make the choice, buy someone else a few more minutes of life. Hope it's enough. Hope it matters. Hope the water stays clean. But I've seen what's in that water now. I felt it swimming through my veins. And sometimes, late at night when Trey wakes up from nightmares, he swears he can still hear me. Not my voice, not words, just clicks and gurgles, carried on the Gulf wind, coming from the direction of the marsh. Calling him back to the water. He never goes. Smart kid.